Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be my matchday 1 defenders cheat sheet. It's also going to be a look at the goalkeepers as well, so stay tuned, of course, if you're looking forward for a goalkeeper pair. Something to mention, of course, is that with the goalkeepers, the most important thing to really look at is that you can't have a goalkeeper pair that plays on the same day. Otherwise, you can't take benefit of the sort of substitution rule in place, so just make sure that when you're picking goalkeepers, that you're not picking players for the same day. That's the only thing I'll say for goalkeepers. As far as defense, most important thing is to get an understanding of, when players or when teams have really good fixtures, right? I think Spain is such a good example to look at because even though we might regard Spain as a good defensive team, and I, of course, as a Spaniard, would love to have a Spanish defender, the reality is for match days 1 and 2, those are the worst games for Spain within their group. And then match day 3 is actually their best game versus Albania. And the issue with that, of course, is depending on the chip strategy you use, it's very likely that most of us managers will be using a chip strategy on match day 3. And if that is the reality, of course, you probably don't want to start the game with a Spanish defender. I can see right now that, for example, someone like Grimaldo has 21% ownership. I wouldn't even say that he's necessarily guaranteed to play left back for the Spanish national team right now as a Spaniard, but we'll get onto that later on in the video. The first most important thing to talk about is the clean sheet odds. And here we have the clean sheet odds provided by my friend Elevenify. This information was taken from his website. His website actually contains a lot of Euro 2024 fantasy predictions, not just for fantasy reasons, but for the tournament in general. He has things like clean sheet odds, which you can see here, obviously. And then he also has important things like predicted goals for teams, predicted goals for players, so on and so forth, even predictions potentially for lineups as well, if you're interested in that sort of thing. So do check out his website. His link is in the description. And without further ado, let's quickly just review the clean sheet odds that we have on display right now. I think the most important thing to look at in terms of these sort of clean sheets is that, as we sort of mentioned, it's more important to not just look at the total clean sheets available, but specifically the clean sheets within match days 1 and 2. So if you've been watching any of my videos recently so far, we do talk about how there are some nice teams that actually have really good fixtures on match day 1 and match day 2 specifically. And I do think that Ukraine and Switzerland definitely fall into this bracket. So when we talk about, for example, the clean sheet odds of these sorts of teams, you can actually see that, for example, Ukraine have great clean sheet odds, really 35%, 36% on match day 1 and 2 specifically. Keep in mind, of course, that these numbers aren't, fixed, right? The numbers will move. It might move also, you can see, on betting markets. And of course, we will get more information about teams, with players dropping out, with injuries, things like that, as we come closer to the tournament. But it's very clear that we have some distinct patterns. One pattern, for example, is how weak Albania is, perceived as an offense, right? So you can see Italy, Croatia, Spain all have ridiculous clean sheet odds on the sort of match that they get to face Croatia with. With Portugal, it's an interesting one because actually their best match, and even England as well, theoretically, is actually going to be on match day 3. So arguably, if you could actually save a little bit of money and you can actually go for example, a Belgian goalkeeper, that could be very interesting. And even a defender as well could be very useful. So, however, teams like England, Belgium, Germany, Portugal, I've got to be honest and say that they're very strong, very standout teams. Going with players within these defenses is never going to put you in a bad position. With France, it's an interesting one. I think if you're targeting, for example, match day 1, it could be justifiable to go for an attacking French defender, someone like Theo Hernandez. It makes a lot of sense. At the same time, when you look at Italy, of course, if you want the same punt, you've got the Italian defense to sort of satisfy that need for you. Going back to sort of talk about specific match days as well, Denmark just have an incredible game in match day 1. So if you're someone who's, for example, punting specifically for match day 1 only, I mean, Denmark definitely is a team that you probably want to be looking at. On top of that, as I said, Ukraine, Switzerland, those are really the only teams to look at where they have really nice fixtures on match day 1 and match day 2. Turkey as well arguably has a pretty good match day 1. So if you can find, for example, a cheap Turkish keeper and you want to go with a 4.5 double pair, if that's allowable, then of course you have an option there. And that's the clean sheet odds. Here, as I said, they are live. They are going to be moving numbers. We're probably going to see them change. Elevenify will also change his numbers as we progress, with the friendlies and get more information about teams heading towards the tournament. So that's it for clean sheet odds. What I've also done for the purposes of the cheat sheet for this video is I've transcribed the clean sheet odds as they are now into an FDR rating for the cheat sheet. So you'll be looking at the fixtures for the cheat sheet, but they will be sort of tiered as per the difficulty of their fixtures based on the clean sheet ranking. And another thing to mention is that I am recording this video and also editing it before the fixtures have been played on Monday, the 3rd of June. So apologies if I've missed anything here. I think the biggest piece of information that we're going to get is going to be maybe a little bit of news on the left back situation for England. On top of that, unfortunately, of course, there are a couple of players between the German team and even the English team, like for example, Bellingham, that will have some impacts due to sort of Champions League celebrations and then also just simply playing within the Champions League. So we'll probably get more information about, what the real German team is, what the real English team is potentially, even though they're the two big teams facing off, or not facing off, but rather playing on Monday here for the friendlies. And we'll get more information because I'll be doing more content around the friendlies and the predicted lineups as we get closer towards the tournament. Anyways, without further ado, let's quickly head on towards the cheat sheet, starting with the cheapest position in the defense right now. We have at the 4 million price point, we have Mittelstadt, who I still think is the starting left back for Germany. The beauty, of course, of this game is that we will start match day 1 with the German team. So we will get the German lineup before the deadline, and you will confirm basically whether Mittelstadt will play and start as a left back. I think he is basically broken. If you have access to a German left back at 4 million, I would never pass up that option. His ownership might be high, but I think it's very justifiable. He is one of the most ridiculous enablers in the game because he's also an attacking player. And you can see that as well with his expected goal involvement as well per 90. So that's really nice to see. Wout Faes is also someone who's interesting from the sort of Belgium national team. What I will say about the Belgium defense is that we have a couple issues, right? Within Euro 2024 fantasy, their left back potentially could be Discoiper. I'm sorry if I'm completely butchering his name. I will study up as we head on towards the tournament, but he could be a starting left back for this Belgian team. But we've also seen different iterations, right? Theat as well has sort of featured, so we don't really know what the Belgian backline is going to be. I expect Vertonghen will play. I expect Faes will play. I expect that the goalkeeping situation is still a 50-50, even though a lot of people and also the manager as well has shown a lot of praise for Casteels, who unfortunately has missed the last couple of games, and Sells has deputized really well. The only thing that I think we can absolutely guarantee is that within the Belgian defense, if you can get access to Faes, then Castagne is a very good option as well, right? Because you're getting access to a fullback who is guaranteed to be nailed. And that's a huge sort of impact on this tournament, given the fact that Belgium have really good fixtures. Jonathan Tah is someone that I think is also world class when it comes to Euro 2024 fantasy as a sort of price point you get access to. If you think about it, Neuer is 6 million, Rudiger is 5.5 million. So between Tah and Schlotterbeck, right, we are expecting one of those two players to fill in that starting position for Germany. In my opinion, I really can't see why Schlotterbeck will play over Jonathan Tah. I think you could argue that Schlotterbeck is a better player, but that's not my job to decide. It's Nagelsmann who has featured and favored Tah over the last few games for this German national team. So I think it's very significant that that's already the sort of preference of the manager. I haven't really seen Nagelsmann dramatically change the team beyond, for example, the bringing back of Toni Kroos into the German national team setup. So I do think Tah starts. However, as I said, I've given an asterisk towards Schlotterbeck just in case we find out before the deadline that he starts over Tah. Clearly, in this situation, it just means that, someone like Tah would be in a void or Schlotterbeck would be in a void. You just pick the other player. And I think, honestly, going double German defense isn't going to be a bad option. Yes, of course, we have a lot of German midfielders that we love, and you might want to double up there. But in my opinion, I think the German defense has been grossly sort of underpriced in terms of the cheap beasts within this team. Of course, Rudiger and Neuer are expensive, but that's not what we're here to look at for. As far as the other 4.5 million players, as I said, Vertonghen's an interesting one. I think I'd class him a tier below just because if you can get access to Faes at 4 million, why not? It's not like Vertonghen is some sort of major attacking threat. You don't need to spend that additional 0.5 million on him, and that's it, right? Unless we are unsure about Faes' position in the team, then of course we can just simply move towards Vertonghen, where Belgium still have amazing clean sheet numbers. As far as the sort of differential tier players here, outside of Schlotterbeck, we're talking about the likes of Cucurella. I've put an asterisk over Cucurella because I think a lot of people have jumped on the Grimaldo bandwagon a little bit too early. First of all, I think the most important thing to mention is when we talk about Leverkusen, what is the structure that Grimaldo probably enjoys the most? Clearly, it's playing within that 5-back structure where Hincapié is effectively a left back. If you look at, for example, the way they play out of the back, and then Grimaldo occupies ridiculous positions in the final third. I've been watching Spain play. And I can tell you right now, there is no way Grimaldo will occupy those positions, and there's no way he's already assumed that level of comfortability within the Spanish national team setup. I actually got to watch him live, when he played in London in a friendly versus Colombia. Wasn't very exciting, and to be honest, I still think that he hasn't really integrated himself too well within the Spanish national team setup. I don't think I'm biased here when I say that Cucurella could very well start ahead of Grimaldo. So for me, this is a true 50-50. You could argue Grimaldo might have the sort of starting position just by default because, of course, Cucurella was a late sort of call-up within the last sort of set of national team call-ups before the provisional squad came out for the Euros. And so, of course, maybe you could argue that Cucurella is now deputizing. But in my opinion, I think the friendlies will sort of determine where we go as the Spanish national team. And I think Grimaldo as well is a little bit overrated because, first of all, when you look at the fixtures for Spain, it's Croatia, then it's Italy, right? The two toughest games. And then on top of that, too, as I said, we play a back four. So it's not going to be, for example, like if you look at, let's say, the Dutch national team and you look at the situation of, let's say, Frimpong versus Dumfries, the biggest difference is that Frimpong would at least be playing in a right wing back position, and that makes a huge difference in terms of his attacking dividends and why you would want to spend that sort of money towards a player like that if you knew, for example, he'd be playing over Dumfries. But that's something to think about. So, and then after that we have Kerkez, Orban, and Ba. Kerkez and Orban, obviously these are Hungarian options. I don't think Hungary have really good clean sheet numbers. However, Orban actually has ridiculous ball recovery stats, and I do think that if you're looking for a player at 4.5 million just to sort of fill in your team, you've already got most of the cheap beasts within your team, and you're somehow trying to spend your money top heavy, within the attacking positions, forwards and midfielders. I can kind of understand going for a differential. I'd probably still pass up on it. If I would go for a Hungarian player, I think I would still tempt myself with Kerkez, who's not 100% nailed, mind you. So that's something to think about. But I'd still probably pass up on these options if I'm being completely honest. With Ba, I think you're looking at a Danish player here who once again has incredible clean sheet numbers for match day 1 and could easily play the fullback position alongside Mela. I think one thing to mention, of course, is that we do like to talk about comfort within a national team setup. I do think Ba is at a ridiculous price. So if you knew that he was going to start for Denmark, that's really good. The other option, I suppose, is Christiansen as well. I am assuming that Ba will start, but of course, we will get better information on that with the friendlies. And if Ba starts, of course, at 4.5 million with the matchday 1 fixture that Denmark have, you aren't basically looking at a free win here. And I do think that it's not even inconceivable, particularly if you're taking that sort of free hit chip strategy, to almost just go for a double Danish defense in match day 1. I don't mind really the idea of going for Ba plus Mela as an example. Moving on towards the 5 million position, I think this is a position where arguably most teams will have their core built around, right? DeMarco, I think, is just ridiculously priced. First of all, 5 million for an extremely attacking player. When you look at, for example, his domestic numbers, it's ridiculous. I do think that when you look at even, for example, his national team numbers for a fullback, they're ridiculous. We have seen, of course, DeMarco even play effectively as a left winger, just out and out at times. And so for me to have access to a player like this with such a good matchday 1 fixture, I think DeMarco is absolutely nailed within my team, and I really struggle to believe that I'll be heading towards matchday 1 without him. As far as Dalot, a lot of people are actually doubting his ability to start for Portugal. And I think if you just look at Dalot and his national team starts in the last few games, whenever he's been out of the squad, that's a separate issue. However, when he's been available for the squad and he's been selected, Dalot has effectively played 90 minutes in every single game possible. So for me, barring obviously the first, I think, 2 games in charge, where of course the new manager came in, Dalot has basically been a key part of this Portuguese setup under Martinez. And in my opinion, I think he should play. So a lot of people thinking about going for Cancelo should also keep an open eye towards Dalot, who in my opinion can start. Obviously, Nuno Mendes does exist, and Cancelo can easily play both fullback positions, but I do think that Dalot is probably still more solid option. There is, of course, a possibility that we have seen at times some managers play with a back 3, potentially having Cancelo as an attacking fullback and then having a sort of winger. And we've seen in the past, right? Someone like Yannick Carrasco, when he was playing with Belgium, was utilized as effectively a left wing back. It might be the case that we see Cancelo right wing back, and then in a left wing back position, you see someone like João Felix being used. I don't think that's likely to happen. So even though there's a small asterisk with Dalot, I really do think he starts, and I think therefore he's a great option, considering that the first game and really the whole group for Portugal is very, very lovely. For Maguire and Stones, I really don't think we need to talk much about the English defense. I think we're expecting them to be the best defense in this tournament. And over the course of the group, even though they actually have a relatively, tough group, for the purposes of looking at specifically these teams compared to, let's say, what Portugal's group is or what Belgium's group is, I do think England are a tier above all the teams in this tournament when it comes to defense. And so because of that, I just think that Maguire and Stones are ridiculous options because they should be nailed and there should be no questions about their value within the game. Castagna, as I mentioned, when I talked about the Belgium sort of national team setup, I do think that he'll start, and I think he's going to be a very good option for most players. And so doubling up on the Belgian defense really strikes to me as a very simple and easy option to do if you have the ability to go there. With Blind, he's an interesting one because of course he played a great season with Girona, and he has been a key part of this Dutch national team setup. We also found out that Madsen was not selected for the provisional squad for the Euros, and that just simply means that Blind will have a little bit more, I think, access to this spot in the team. I suppose the one shift that could happen is maybe if Van de Ven gets integrated within the team a little bit more, which I think is very unlikely anyways. For me, Blind should be starting left wing back effectively for this Dutch team. Obviously, they're a little bit asymmetric, right? I don't think you can expect that Blind will be as attacking as a Dumfries or a Frimpong on the right hand side. But access to the Dutch national team defense is actually something that is quite expensive outside of the goalkeeping position, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So I do think that Blind is an interesting option for people to kind of keep an eye over. The unfortunate thing, of course, is that they do have France, and it's not like the group is a cakewalk for Netherlands. Matchday 1, not so bad though. Shaw is an interesting one where I think clearly the position is to be fought between Shaw and Trippier is actually ridiculously overpriced in my opinion within the game, because I think we definitely expect that Walker will start on the right back position. So the question, of course, is going to be who plays left back. Is it Trippier? Is it Shaw? Now, if Shaw, of course, is ready to come back into the team, which I think is also a little bit improbable, because if you think about it, he's been out for a long while now. There have been setbacks with his injury progress, so it's very unlikely, in my opinion, that Shaw maybe starts match day 1. But of course, if he can get some friendly minutes within his boots, he might still start match day 1, and that could be a huge punt to the ability to go for an extremely attacking player, at least when he plays for the national team in Shaw, and that for me is very brilliant. As far as Laporte, for the same reasons where I kind of explained that I don't really like going for a Spanish defender because of the fixtures and how they're outlined. I just think that Laporte is insanely nailed, and of course he's a good pick, but for me can only be a yellow tier pick because it is the lay of the land. Unfortunately, Spain are just a team that I probably wouldn't invest too highly into when it comes to targeting them from a Euro 2024 fantasy point of view. Maybe when they reach the knockout stages, we have a separate discussion to be had, depending on how the Spain team looks. Obviously, some people are looking at the Spanish squad and thinking it's very weak. In my opinion, it's not that weak, but ultimately it misses key players like Gavi. It still misses key players even in, for example, other positions in the past. When you look at, for example, the sort of attacking players that Spain have at their disposal, I just think that, yeah, when you're looking at Croatia and Italy, those are tougher games. Are you expecting Spain to be resolute at the back? Probably. They could do so, but it's unlikely, and the clean sheet odds pretty much bear that out as well. The best time to target Spain is match day 3, and we can revisit that then. As far as the next options, of course, at 5.5 million, once again, another sort of strong sort of tier of players, but once again, a little bit more expensive than the 5 million players, and I'd argue that some of these players might not be worth the price. Rudiger is an interesting one because, of course, he's a huge set piece threat. So even though some center backs at cheaper prices like Maguire and Stones are going to be much more appealing to people, I suppose you can always argue that Rudiger has insane attacking threat, and that's obviously quite significant. However, it's not like Maguire and Stones are incapable of having attacking threat as well. So I think that's a little bit overblown. Rudiger, for me, is still well priced in the context that he is a nailed player for this sort of German setup. You could argue that, for example, if, let's say, Schlotterbeck is in the squad and Tah is not playing very well, I'd assume that Rudiger keeps his spot. There could be opportunities where Tom might be an early substitution, which I still think is unlikely, but it's possible. With Theo Hernandez, once again, France's group isn't brilliant, but because Austria is match day 1, I still think that you have a good punt here. And then, of course, match day 3 is nice as well if you're going for a chip and going for, the Theo Hernandez gambit. Lucas Hernandez has been the player who usually has been playing left back, and basically whenever Lucas Hernandez gets injured, which happened last international tournament and also happened unfortunately within the Champions League, Theo Hernandez basically just gets to step in there. Now, he's always been more of an attacking player for AC Milan, and it's not necessarily the case that the French fullbacks have always been a pivotal part of the team. We've also seen that Ferland Mondi has been called up, so arguably, if, let's say, fans prefer the sort of resoluteness of some of their fullbacks on defense, then maybe you could see Teo Hernandez benched. I think it's unlikely. I think he'll still play, given that he's been obviously a key part of the squad recently. But the punt might not be as good as some people think. As I said, he clearly plays a much more attacking role for Milan, and I don't think that we should sort of overrate how great he can be on an attacking level for the French national team. I think if you had to compare him to someone like, for example, Mela is always someone who just has so much more of a key role for this Danish team compared to, let's say, Teo Hernandez does for the French national team. So something to think about as well, even though actually Teo Hernandez, within his sort of short stint with the national team, has really, really good numbers. But I think the key thing to point out with Teo Hernandez, though, is that unfortunately there is a small sample size with the national team too. With Walker, once again, you're looking at a very defensive player. So even though I have him green, I think the reality is just because I'm just sort of giving respect to England being a top team the same way I would give Rudiger the respect for Germany being a top team. But I'd still prefer the 5 million options. With Di Lorenzo as well, similar case where I think you can go for Di Lorenzo if you're trying to target, for example, a huge punt over Italy and for match day 1. So if you're, let's say, planning to use chips for match day 1, for match day 2, and match day 3, that's fine, right? Because you can just punt exclusively for match day 1 and go for an Italian defender. If you had to pick between one Italian defender for Dimarco and Di Lorenzo, and also kind of consider the situation where unfortunately Scalvini is injured as well, you could see someone like Mancini step up and maybe play and start a game in match day 1. At that point, of course, you've got access to an Italian defender at 4.5 million. Maybe Di Lorenzo is not someone you want to go with. Bastoni, however, I think is absolutely nailed as well. So for me, he's another great pick. And there is no harm really in going for a strategy that targets specifically Italy versus Albania in match day 1, and to kind of go in with the chips early. So because I kind of don't mind that strategy, I have to pay respect to that too, which is why obviously you can see these Italian players are sort of well respected with match day 1 because they just have such a good fixture from a clean sheet perspective. Now with Dumfries, with Frimpong, the argument here, of course, is what are we going to do with these two players ultimately, right? I do think that Dumfries should start. If you look at, for example, legacy, if you look at lineage as well, clearly I think Dumfries is someone who should start, and it's not like his national team performances have dropped off, for example. Another thing to mention too is I do think that the coach is someone who does pay respect to the level that some of his players are sort of showing on a domestic level. For example, you'll see the coach will obviously talk about how Depay had a really poor year when it comes to the minutes that he's gotten within Atletico Madrid. So clearly, I think that is a factor. And of course, if you want to look into domestic sort of performance, Frimpong clearly has one of the most outrageous seasons for a fullback, potentially even in history. So Frimpong is an interesting one, but I still think that Dumfries will win out in that spot for match day 1, and that's really what you're looking at here with Netherlands. So unfortunately, I think I'd probably go with Dumfries if I was really going for that free hit sort of triple punt in the group stages. But if you're not going for that, there's no real reason to I think, gamble on who the sort of Dutch right wing back is right now. Carvajal, similar situation where, of course, a little bit more attacking compared to, let's say, Laporte, probably going to be a key player for Spain. But once again, fixtures just aren't there for me the same way they might be for some other teams, like, for example, Italy, who have basically the flipped order of Spain. As far as Robertson, Guardiola, these sorts of players for me are differentials once again. Guardiola has his worst fixture in match day 1. Robertson has his worst fixture in match day 1 as well. Why you'd want to go for these players, I don't really know. Obviously, when you look at a domestic level, Robertson's an incredible attacking fullback. Guardiola is an incredible attacking fullback, arguably a traditional center back converted into playing left back / left wing for Man City. With Robertson, of course, you can also say that he's been playing effectively a wing position too. But once again, it comes down to the fact that I think that they are not expected to do too much damage in match day 1, given the fixture on display. So I really think they have to be classed as a differential. Moving on, though, at 6 million, I think one thing to point out is, I've clearly shown a preference, and we always tend to show a preference for attacking fullbacks within fantasy games. Because another point to mention, too, is that sometimes based on the sort of team style that you have, it's not necessarily the case that with ball recoveries within the game that only center backs are capable of ball recoveries. If you actually look at some of the ball recoveries numbers for the entire cheat sheet so far, you'll actually notice that a lot of the attacking fullbacks have better ball recovery numbers than, let's say, some of the defenders. Diaz is a good example of that. And part of that too, of course, is just how their teams play domestically compared to how that converts into the national team. So that's something to sort of think about and pay respect to. But going back to the point, I do think Van Dijk is insane because As far as I understand, I think Van Dijk is on penalties. The coach has basically mentioned this. Now, Depay in the past has taken penalties. Some of the players within the Dutch national team are all capable of taking penalties as well. But I can't really see why, I'd be so opposed to the idea of Virgil van Dijk taking penalties. And I have to sort of trust the coach here and just sort of take the words for what it is and expect that Virgil van Dijk versus matchday 1 in Poland could be a penalty taker. And for me, that's a very exciting punt. We don't usually get access to defenders who take penalties, and whenever we do, I think we tend to love them. I will probably try to make room for Van Dijk within one of my drafts, and we'll see what we can do, but I think that's exceptionally interesting, particularly if you are on that sort of match day 1, match day 2, match day 3 free hit strategy. As far as Cancelo, though, you can't really pass up on an option that's this good. I do think that the interesting thing is a lot of the other players within the sort of green price points are extremely good. So if you don't want to spend 6 million on Cancelo or 6 million on Virgil van Dijk, I think that's totally fine. That's justifiable, right? I still think, for example, Dalot should start match day 1, and in my opinion, even match day 2. Maybe, of course, you can see Nuno Mendes play match day 3, but the key thing with Cancelo, I think, is that he's more likely to get the minutes over both these two players. And so you have that guaranteed minutes element. And of course, probably he is the more attacking player when it comes to the sort of balance of the fullback. So that's something to mention with Cancelo. With Diaz, you're looking at someone who really is a little bit overpriced given the context here, right? You're looking at purely ball recoveries, maybe, of course, being a small set piece threat, but you'd much rather someone who has intangibles like Van Dijk has with potential penalties, or Cancelo, of course, as an attacking fullback. With Trippier, in my opinion, I think he's a little bit overpriced given the sort of price points of all the other English defenders, and that's pretty much my thoughts on the defense. Shifting gears quickly towards the goalkeepers, I don't really think there's too much of a sort of change in terms of our understanding of things. The most important thing to call out is that we have one huge potential punt, which is what happens if suddenly Matt Sells is potentially that starting goalkeeper for Belgium. In my opinion, that would be once again a little bit game breaking because that's way too cheap for a Belgian defense that you could potentially go Sells plus Faze for the total cost of 8 million when they have ridiculously good fixtures. Now, let's be honest, we've looked at Belgium historically and their defense isn't great anyways, but at that sort of price point, I think it's hard to ignore them given the opponents that they have. So if Sells is someone, as I said, with a triple asterisk here, because it's either Sells or Casteels, it's a 50-50, but a lot of people would argue that it's maybe favored still towards Casteels, who's the historical number 1 of the team. And of course, the manager has already praised Casteels plenty of times, even calling him a top 20 goalkeeper within the world. However, he's also been extremely appraising of Sells. And you can see Thibaut Courtois, for example, was also, not brought to this tournament because he was seen to be not ready. Although, of course, I think there's a little bit of drama behind the scenes for Belgium that I won't get into. I just think it's interesting, right? If we look at the friendlies and if somehow Sells starts both games for the friendlies, I do think that Sells is an insane pick to start with for the tournament. Lunin, of course, is brilliant as well. We talked about the idea of how if you go for the Ukrainian goalkeeper and the Swiss goalkeeper, these are players who have really good fixtures for match day 1, match day 2. It allows you to go for limitless match day 3, and you'll be really well set up if you go for these goalkeepers. Verbruggen is another interesting one because I think even though he's super well priced, you don't necessarily have a good match day 2 fixture. So Verbruggen is probably only better for those sorts of managers who are going for a punt in terms of match day 1 specifically, right? Where you go free hit effectively by using limitless and wild card within match day 2 and 3. So something to think about there. With Pickford, once again, you have the access to basically the best option between match day 1 and match day 3. However, of course, if you take away the value of match day 3, it's not necessarily the case that you have to spend that sort of money towards Pickford. At the same time, though, I think you can't pass up on the idea that England are still the best defense. So if you're someone who doesn't really believe in clean sheet odds, you just believe in the strength of a defense and that you think that good teams will get good clean sheets, more often, then of course the logic holds for Pickford that he's probably the best goalkeeper based on pricing. I think he's a little bit underpriced, if I'm being completely honest. Potentially even the entire English defense should be 5.5 million bare minimum, but they've been really kindly priced, and therefore you have access to Pickford. At the same time, Costa is also really well priced. Diogo Costa, that is, from Portugal, and he also has better fixtures compared to Pickford. So that's why you can see the clean sheet odds being very similar, to be honest, between Portugal and England. The only thing that's interesting is because the English team is so resolute, Arguably, Pickford has actually less access to save points, but of course, you can argue the flip side of that is, higher clean sheet odds. So something to think about. Sommer, as I mentioned, with Switzerland, with Lunin, really interesting options for match day 1 and 2, targeting both specifically. Schmeichel's interesting, particularly just for match day 1. But because we might have access to, Danish players from other positions, particularly, the fullbacks, I think I'd probably still pass up on Schmeichel. And of course, fixtures after that aren't great. With Livakovic, it's the case where his best fixture is match day 2. And even though we actually think that Croatia is historically a very good defense, would I actually want to spend money or even go towards the Croatian goalkeeper at the start of this tournament? Probably not. And then at the 5.5 million, 6 million territory, it's a case of all the premiums, right? Magnan has actually come back into training, Coman as well, apparently, as sort of confirmed by Deschamps. So it's very likely we'll see Magnan play. But do I really want to sort of go for a French defender that's not Theo Hernandez at 5.5 million? Probably not. And then also the other keepers, in my opinion, just have bad fixtures like Simon or with Donnarumma and Neuer. Unfortunately, just too expensive. And that's pretty much my thoughts on the goalkeepers. And that's your defenders and goalkeepers video for the cheat sheet. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Enjoy the friendlies, and we'll see you guys soon for more content.